All right, thank you, everybody. We do appreciate you coming, and we're looking forward to spending a few minutes tonight talking a little bit about Bass Academy. And I want to start by saying um, I think this is, I'm not sure how to express the difficulty of this conversation with Bass Academy. For those of us who have been a part of Bass Academy, or alumni of Bass Academy, or even just have attended camp meeting here for Gulf States, I mean, you know how important Bass Academy is. And really, to us Seventh Day Adventists from that southern part of Mississippi, it's really been a central hub of our experience here. So, um, we just want to talk a little bit about it and be prayerful. The point of where we're trying to go is looking for plans that can help Bass Academy continue to operate. So the goal tonight is that I'm going to share, help us as constituents understand the circumstances of Bass Academy, what the executive committee is wrestling with. At the conclusion tonight, we'll be able to try to answer some questions. And the goal is, and we'll talk about it again, is that if you have ideas, if you have plans, I know that I've talked already with some of the alumni. There are plans that are being developed to be able to present to the committee to try to kind of bring Bass back onto a sound financial basis. I want to take just a moment and talk about how funding works here in Gulf States Conference to understand that our executive committee here are the ones who provide guidance for us when it comes to spending. And the way that kind of works is the administrative team brings a budget to the executive committee and they approve that budget. When they approve that budget, we're then authorized to spend what has been approved in that budget. If there's something beyond that budget, something additional to that budget, or if there's write-offs to that budget, then we need to bring those back to the committee to get approval for them since they haven't been approved. And the reason that is important is because it's kind of the conversation of how we came here. Um, each year that Bass operates, it has, in a few minutes, we'll take a look at the graph. We will show the losses that we've had in the operation of Bass. Those losses exceed the amount that the conference has budgeted. And so we'll take a look at that. But the difference between what's budgeted and those losses, it needs to be provided for in some way. And sometimes what conferences will do, they will just let that accounts receivable build and build. And you've heard those stories where an academy is, millions of dollars in debt. That's not really fair to the academy, and we haven't done that. So each year we bring to the executive committee the budget that Bass has, and we tell the committee the expected amount that Bass is going to be short. And so, in other words, that's going to be a write off or an expenditure that's beyond the budget. And so, we're kind of preparing our committee for what that might look like. Bass's enrollment, we'll talk a little bit about it, is down this year. And so, we did bring back to our committee in October the projected Bass budget. The committee spent about 3 hours talking about this, kind of wrestling with this. And at the end of that meeting, they did not make a decision. We'll talk a little bit more. A decision is scheduled for January 7th for the committee to come and talk. Um, but in this meantime, between October 15th and January 7th, our goal was to go back out and solicit ideas that can help Bass be more sustainable, to solicit contributions, things that could help kind of offset the numbers a little bit as we work to turn Bass around. And so that's really what we're doing here tonight as a town hall meeting. Our goal is to educate kind of what the situation is. Our goal is to try to answer questions that we can that can kind of help provide the feedback. And then hopefully ideas and plans will be coming into us so that we can bring those to the committee. And that's what we intend to do. bring these different plans to the committee. In a little bit, I'll share with you my email address that you can send those ideas. Each of those ideas will be presented to the committee on January 7th. Um, the reason January 7th is significant is if we're going to operate Bass next year, we need to get teacher contracts. If we're not going to operate Bass next year, it's in January that the job postings are set up for the next year. And so we want to treat our staff with respect. We want to make sure that they have the time that they need those 5 months as they transition. Um, it is a challenge for our committee. And we're going to look at the numbers in a little bit, but our committee is trying to balance the various ministries here in our conference. Of course, providing pastors. We're going to talk about the ministry of elementary schools in our conference. Of course, we have Bass in our conference. We've got Camp Alamisco in our conference. And so that committee is always trying to weigh out the best way to try to provide for all of these ministries. And so that'll be part of the challenge. I shared with you already the purpose to gather ideas. On January 7th, the decision that the committee will be making is to whether to operate Bass for the 25-26 school year. So this school year is going to complete there at the end of May, but the real decision to be made is if we're going to operate it for the next school year. And so again, we're hoping to be able to. You can see on the screen there my email address. And so you'll have it a couple more times. If you have some ideas that can help Bass, please email that to me. I've got some of the ideas are smaller, some of them are larger and more complex, but we sure want to hear all of those ideas. I want to share with you a little bit of some of the subsidies that have been put into Bass. What you see here is about 7 years, the last 7 years of subsidies. You can see that in 2018, the conference put about 1.1 million there in Bass. 2019, it was about 900,000. 2020, it was about 1.7 million that year. 21 was again about 1.2. 22 is about 1.1. 2023 was 1.6. And as we wrestled as the committee, we looked at the numbers. In 2024, it will be close to $2 million in this calendar year for our conference. You know, just to get some perspective on the size of that number, for our conference, we retain just about $10 million in tithe. And so you're looking at almost 20%. And look, you can see on the screen there, 18.5% of our entire budget is being used to fund Bass Academy. We're going to talk a little bit about the enrollment now, which is about 48. But regardless of the enrollment, that percentage is really too high. I want to take a little bit deeper look at the budget this year. I shared with you the estimated subsidy for 2024, estimated because we're almost at the end of the year, is about $2 million, just about. But the budgeted subsidy is $434,000. And so you can see the gap there that the committee is wrestling with is how do we fund this $1.5 million that we haven't budgeted for, that we don't have in the budget? How are we going to fund this? And so as we come to the end of the year, and as you look back on some of those years, what we've really done is often funded Bass with our tithe gains. In other words, when we budget, we'll use an example of we're going to budget on our previous year's tithe. So we would budget 98, but we're going to be simple and call it 100%. So if last year's retained tithe was 10 million, we're going to budget 10 million. And we're spreading that 10 million out between pastors and teachers and ministries and Camp Alamisco and Bass Academy. But the challenge is that runs out. And so we have a balanced budget. That budget's about 4.4 million, 4.3, I'm sorry, 434,000 for Bass is kind of what that budget is. Now, if we have a tithe gain, that gives us additional resources And really, that's what we've done the last few years. We've given bass the tide gains that we've experienced. Um, this year, we're not in that position. This year, our tithe is down. And so, what we've had to do this year is pull about $1.6 million from our reserves to be able to continue to operate bass. Um, with these kinds of costs, it's difficult for us. Did I lose my screen sharing? Okay, perfect. With these kinds of costs, it's difficult for us. In fact, we can't have a balanced budget because there's no way we can put these losses in bass into the budget and have a balanced budget. So each year we realize we're not working with a balanced budget. We're trying to figure out how to manage that. This year we've had to pull 1.6 million from our reserves to provide for those losses. This method of running a business is not the way you run a business without balanced budgets. And so it is a challenge for our committee, challenge for us as administrative team. How do we really bring a real balanced budget, which encompasses the losses of bass, without having to cut or in some way make it fit? You'll remember back on the screen, what we've seen is that the losses of bass have been escalating over the past few years. Um, and so as the committee wrestles with that, currently right now we have $5.4 million left in our working reserves. So we started the year with about 7 million in working reserves. That's about what we're required to have, about 6 or 7 months of reserves. Um, and we've, as I shared, really covered the difference in bass. The 2 million in bass, less the 400,000 we budget, and the remainder of that loss has been pulled from reserves, and we currently have 5.4 million reserves. It is important that we turn bass around. As we talk about that with the committee, I don't think that would happen instantly. I think that it's a process. It would take 2 years or 3 years to really get the enrollment back up to get bass turned around. And so the committee is wrestling. How long can we carry those losses? How will that impact our reserves? It is not a positive thing to bring back to our constituents that over the last few years we've used our reserves. That puts our conference at risk. We've seen conferences that have had financial difficulties, and so that's a wrestling for our committee as well. How do we handle this stewardship? How do we balance all of these things out? Um, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it at the end. But one of the things that we've done is we're saying we need partners. If Bass is going to turn around, in fact, many of us who are connected with Bass, we remember the history of the penny campaign. And if you're on the alumni page, it was amazing to see some of those pictures from that day. And it really was a rallying around that. And so we are asking that our conference, again, if Bass is important, to us, that we rally around it, that those costs are kind of shared. And so ideally, we're looking to have donors, alumni, constituents, others who would commit to $1 million for the next several years, 3 years, to try to help provide that turnaround like we've experienced. But I want to talk to you about some of the challenges that we have there. And one of those challenges, and I'll break it down in more detail, is really the rapid inflation that has happened the last 4 years. Because what we see is this large increase in costs, but we're not able to pass those costs on. In fact, what we see is that the families that we serve are struggling financially. So, in this time of inflation, they're struggling in an increased way because of the inflation. And we're seeing the escalating costs there at Bass. You can see there on the screen in 2019, these are our employee costs. It's not what we pay our employees, but it's the cost of employees. It's the cost of the medical, health insurance, cost of retirement, cost of education benefits, all of those types of things. So in 2019, you see it was about 1.2 million. By 2023, you see the cost had escalated to 1.5 million. Now it's interesting that cost difference of about 318,000. Um, Let me back up, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. Um, I served you all as Gulf States Conference treasurer from about 15 to about 20. And in 19, it was not hard to see that we needed additional means of financial support for Bass. I think everyone knows that. All academies struggle, and so we reopened the endowment in 2019. Um, but really, what's happened is the costs have actually escalated greater than the endowment. We activated the endowment this year at 7 million. It pays out 4%, so that's 280,000. And so what we see is in 2019, our employee costs were 1.2 million. Well, we really need to build an endowment. So we start building the endowment. And by 2013, the cost have actually exceeded the endowment so that we're actually in worse shape with the endowment because of the escalation in cost than we were in 2019. Of course, that doesn't include all the other operational costs, utilities, insurance, food, all of those things that have increased as well. In fact, you'll remember, this is amazing to me. In June of 2022, they reported that inflation had increased 9% from the last year. Now, the target for the US is below 2%. And so I'm rounding, but I'm not really. In 1 year, we had a decade worth of inflation. A decade worth of inflation. In other words, the inflation we've seen the last few years, we really probably wouldn't be here with these expenses. These would have been 15 years down the road if we had experienced inflation that was what we would call historical. And so this really accelerated the problem because all of a sudden our costs are what they would be 15 years from now in the future, but our revenues are struggling because our families are struggling as well. As we look to the 25-26 school year, it's estimated that the employee cost would be about 1.8 million. So you went from 1.2 million in 19 to 1.8 million these 6 years later. And, that increase is a 33% increase, an increase in cost of 600,000 just in labor. And what it became clear is that the endowment can't keep pace with that in spite of it. Um, I want to take a moment here and kind of set that aside because the inflationary period that Bass experienced is also being experienced in our elementary schools. When I began serving U.S. Treasurer, the cost for a teacher per month at our elementary schools was around the $4,600 a month. But as we look at the 25-26 school year, it's going to be about 6,180 a month per teacher. We're just a few ways. If inflation, if it keeps running at that 2 to 3, and hopefully it's coming down, but we're a few years from that cost being $7,000 a month. And what we're seeing is the strain in our local elementary schools. And so the committee is wrestling with how do we've got to support our elementary schools because we see they're coming into that same inflation trap, because I can assure you that the tuition that they're charging is not up the 35% over the teacher costs that were there in 2015-16. And so those churches are feeling that same pressure as well, and we need to wrestle with that. When we think about the Bass budget, when we're thinking about the current school year, we readjusted that budget down to the enrollment, and it shows a loss of about $1.2 million. That loss of $1.2 million is after the conference subsidy of $434,000, after the nursing home contribution, which is about $390,000, after the endowment, which began to pay out this school year, of 280,000. So you add up all of those subsidies, all three of those together, which is what about we say 4 and 8 and 1.1 million. So with those 1.1 million in subsidies, which we're thankful for, there's still on top of that projecting a $1.2 million loss that that we'll be wrestling with. Um, this is another challenge for us there at Bass Academy. We're thankful we had someone who works in property kind of come through and look at the campus. And they shared with us, it's a little embarrassing, but they shared with us that we're probably about $2 million behind in maintenance. And that's really because we haven't been able to fund the depreciation expense. And so we're behind, and that's starting to hurt us. The last couple years, we've had major maintenance issues. It's about 20 years since Katrina. So a lot of the systems and things that were redone in Katrina, the heat and air systems are needing to be redone. Over the last couple years, we would be putting in over 200,000 in cash to just try to catch up some of these maintenance things. But the truth is, we have a campus that is several $1 million behind, and really needs some updating, needs some work. This is also the case for Camp Alamisco, where we haven't had the resources to really invest in the capital projects there, because it feels like most of the dollars are being used just to operate, and there's not a lot of resources left to deal with those capital maintenance issues. The current enrollment at Bass is about 48 students. Of that current enrollment, 29 of them are from our conference. And I want to just share some illustrations that I think to show us really the gravity of what we're dealing with. Those 29 students from our conference, I'm just going to call it 30. Um, if we wanted to provide for them a boarding academy experience, which I have to tell you was one of the experiences I really value. Uh, I've heard from alumni, all of us love the friends that we made there, the fellowships that happen at Bass, the things that happen in a boarding academy can't really be replicated in another environment. Those deep friendships that are formed. If we wanted to make sure that those 30 students had a boarding academy experience, Gulf States Conference could fund them completely, to Highland, to GCA, to Ozark. So we could send those 29 students to that academy free, and the cost to Gulf States would be $600,000. So we're spending $2 million to do what could be done with $600,000. If we wanted to send all of those students to Andrews University to college, the college tuition there at Andrews University is about $44,000. So we could take our family, our 29 students, and we could send them for free to Andrews for about 1.2, 1.3 million. So we could give them a free college experience at Andrews University, and that would actually save Gulf States Conference about $700,000. And that begins to give an idea of really how out of balance these numbers are. It's costing us more for those 29 students than it would be to send them up to Andrews or Southern. Currently, the student body there at Bass, we have 3 students in the freshman class, and we have about 20 students in the senior class. You know, we talk about Bass, and I want to try to highlight another, because for quite some time, you know, in my own mind, I really thought the challenge to Bass was enrollment. In other words, we need to get enrollment up. We need to increase enrollment. If we could just increase enrollment. But as I dug into the numbers deeper, I want to share this with you. We have 48 students, and the total tuition that is being paid by those 48 students. And there's a range depending upon their ability to pay. We have some that are full pay and some that are heavily into worthy student. But if you took all of that and you averaged them together, we receive $400,000 in tuition from these 48 students. Now, the tuition there at Bass, the tuition plus enrollment is about 20,000. So if we put that in a monthly term, it would be the expectation that the students would be that we would be receiving about $20,000 per student in income. With the 48 students we have, if you had that, the expectation we would have $1 million in tuition revenue with 50 students. But instead of $1 million, which is what you would expect, the the tuition has been discounted on average by 60%. And so that average is about, students are paying about $800 a month for that boarding academy experience. That's a challenge for us. You know, here in Montgomery, you can get daycare for about $800 a month. It's $150 to $200 per week. And so what we have is students that are paying daycare rates and receiving room, receiving board, receiving an education, 24/7 staffing, electricity, all of those things. And you can see that that's a real challenge. So the challenge is, if you take the pool of students that we have, and our capacity is between 90 and 100, and you double our enrollment, you go out there and you double the enrollment in the same pool that we currently have, then you're going to have a revenue of about $800,000. Can I remind you that expected cost for staff is $1.8 million, which means that the tuition is not even covering 50% of the staff. There's $1 million shortfall. The challenge to that is it is a struggle for our families to pay. Mississippi, Alabama are some of the poorest. It is the poorest states, really, in the country. The average salary is for Alabama, Mississippi, $47,000 to $50,000. So you come to a family and you say, "Hey, we have this great experience for you. It's $20,000, but their salary is $50,000." You can see it's hard. It's not that the families don't want to pay. We're not in a place where there's strong economies. It's a challenge for us at Bass Academy that we're not really able to retain graduates. Even in our states, it's difficult for us to retain our own children because the economic opportunities are just greater outside our area. And so the issues really are larger than just an enrollment issue. Um, you know, we currently don't have any industries, and that's hard to imagine. I mean, I was there at Bass. Remember the Butler industry, which was a great industry. We've had the blueberry industry. They go back. There was a dairy farm industry. There was a pine straw industry. Currently, the nursing home doesn't have students working there. And so we literally have nowhere for our students to work that brings in revenue to the school. And so the school does employ the students, and the students receive a credit on that bill, but the cost of that credit is really passed on at the end of the day to the conference to provide the support for that. And so that's a challenge. It's also, and I don't, I don't know what we do about it. There's labor laws that present challenges that we didn't have in the 80s. Yeah, I think about it when I was there at Bass. I love the memories. I worked at the nursing home and became a certified nurse's assistant. So proud of it, CNA. But I can tell you the things that I did as a CNA there, the students would not be allowed to do. The labor laws in that environment has changed. There's some other headwinds that we face with Bass, and one of those is that the size of families have changed. In the U.S. now, the average family is 3.1, which basically means one child. So as we look around our conference, and if we have the same number of families, what we don't have is the same number of potential students. One of the more common things I hear, and it was shared quite often on the Bass alumni page, and as I talk with people, um, today people aren't as interested in sending their children away from home at age 14 or 15. What they say is, I'm not done parenting. I only have one or two children, and I want to parent them as long as I can. And so there is more hesitance to send to the boarding academy because parents really want to try to spend that extra time with them. Um, Talked already, inflation costs have really limited our ability to receive more. Our collections are only at 40%. They need to. I don't know how you can say they need to be higher. I don't know how you get them higher. I want to take a moment and talk a little bit about parents' desire to keep their children at home. And since I was at Bass, a graduate of '85, at that point in time, there were no other Seventh Day Adventist academy or high school options in our conference. It was Bass or it was nothing. But those times have changed. And in fact, currently we have three other high school options outside of Bass. So today we have four high school options in our conference. We have Hoover with Lori that operates a wonderful school. We have Big Cove up in Huntsville, and they operate a distance learning high school tied in with Atlanta AAA. There's 7 students there. Floral Crest offers the same thing. And what we're seeing is that parents are looking for options to keep their kids at home and still have a Seventh day Adventist educational experience. And so, in a couple of these larger cities, the elementary schools have moved that direction. I want to talk a little bit about the pool of recruiting for Bass. The 8th grade graduating classes for Bass, you'll see the numbers there. In 2022-23, we had 21 graduates from 8th grade. These would be potential students for Bass Academy. 23-24, we had 25. 24-25, we had 21. Hoover, which has a very strong program, I took those out because it would be difficult. But to give you an idea of the number of graduates we have really available, you can see that 18 or 19 is really the number. We need 40 new students a year to keep Bass at its capacity. We don't get all 18. In fact, generally what we get is somewhere around half. You can kind of see that we've got 29 students. You divide it by 4 and it's 7 point something, 7 to 8 students. So that's what we're getting each year from our conference on average, which is really less than half of the graduates as parents make some other choices. Want to talk about some additional headwinds. We talked already about the salaries, the distance learning option. Um, Currently we talked a little bit about we would really. I think the conference is going to need to partner. I think historically the alumni and the alumni president can correct me, but it's $30,000 to $50,000 that we receive from the alumni each year. And so, we would really love to see the alumni, be a part of helping this. We've already talked a little bit about that $1 million. At the end of this, Carmen is kind of quarterbacking that for us. She's keeping a track for pledges. And so at the end, we'll give you the contact. She'll be able to say a few words as well about how to pledge and be a part. What we're taking is pledges and not asking for money at this moment, and we'll break that down a little bit more. One more before we move on, talking about how things are different. For those students, Seventh day Adventist students that are in Florida, many of you are aware that Florida, the state of Florida, has enacted school choice. And what that means is that you're able to get $7,200 a year to use at a private school of your choice. And so this is kind of wonderful for our Seventh-day Adventist schools there in Florida, but it also creates this interesting dynamic because now it's a wonderful thing. The parents can send their kids basically for free. But now, when they get to eighth grade, these parents who haven't been paying anything for a Seventh-day Adventist education, you now say, "Hey, come on over here to Bass, and it's only 20,000 per year." Um, I would expect that we will see in the future probably our Florida schools looking to do some distance learning to be able to provide a Seventh-day Adventist high school education that's at home, and the cost would be fairly low with that state funding. We're also seeing this trend in Alabama. It will begin in 2025. It's a ramping up, so there's a 3-year ramp up, but Alabama is going to be allowing $7,000 of school choice here in Alabama. That should be a benefit to our Alabama schools. But again, what it comes back to is it makes recruiting for Bass difficult when you say, wow, I could attend a Seventh Adventist school in Alabama in the future for Alabama's 7,000. Or I could send my child away and pay $20,000 to send them away or keep them at home in an Adventist education at really no cost. It really makes the recruiting difficult and tough for us. Want to take a few minutes and talk a little bit about the endowment. Its balance is about 7.6 million. You see there, when we relaunched it in 2019, you can see that in the 6-year period, 6 years will be March of 2025. We've received $4.8 million in donations. I wanted to break down these donations because there's been a lot of conversations around the endowment. I guess I would start by highlighting that the largest contributor to the endowment is the Gulf States Conference Executive Committee. Those contributions, every one of them, were voted by that committee. They started in 2019, and I think this shows the commitment that our committee had. As you see those losses, and here's the committee understanding that we need to do this, and so I appreciate the committees, several of them that have worked with this over the years. You'll see the second largest contributor is the nursing home, Adventist Health Center. We have a wonderful board. I serve on that board as treasurer, and they have also been a part of supporting the endowment. We have donations. There's been churches who sold their property and say, we want that to go to the endowment, and we thank them. We have advertised to all of our constituents every year. We've sent out the endowment cards trying to highlight and you know, some people have said, why didn't the conference bring this up earlier? Why didn't you talk about this earlier? And I'm going to suggest that we have been talking about the need to provide financial support for Bass. Every camp meeting, we talk about it. We talk about the endowment. Alumni, we talk about the endowment because this is a crucial factor. One of the things that plays into that, as I shared with you, is we literally had a decade and a half of inflation and cost over the past few years that was completely unanticipated. You can see we had a couple of donors there for the endowment. We were appreciative. Those are alumni donors. And then the rest of our conference and the rest of alumni have given that 474,000, and we appreciate all of their support there for the endowment. Let's see. I think we've talked about that. In fact, that slide looks like I hit the wrong way button or something. Yeah. I want to just take a moment and we'll try to wrap up. What would happen to the endowment if Bass were to close? The endowment was provided to provide secondary education at Bass Academy. If Bass ceases to operate, it would continue to function as well as it could, which means that it would, first of all, excuse me, provide scholarships to our young people in our conference who want a boarding academy experience and they choose to go to Ozark or Highland or GCA or something like that, that we would provide scholarships for them out of the endowment. If there are additional funds from the endowment, we can use those to help support other existing high schools in our conference. And if there are existing funds after that, we would be able to use those to support elementary schools. So that's what would happen to it. I want to talk just a minute about the Constitution of Bass Academy. If you'll go on to the GSC webpage, which many of you did tonight to get the link, you'll see the latest. There was a Constitution that was older floating around, but we've posted the most recent one on there so you can download that and look at that. The Constitution talks about dissolving Bass Academy. What our executive committee is talking about is we're not talking about dissolving Bass Academy, um, but really just sharing that we're not able to fund it. We don't have the resources to fund it. And so if the executive committee chose not to fund Bass Academy or to fund Bass Academy at a level in which it could not operate, then Bass Academy would cease operations. It would still be in existence and an entity. It would still have its campus there because it's not dissolved. It would just be ceasing operations. Um, to give you an example of how that works, that's the way it happens in our conference. If we have a church that closes before a constituency session, it ceases operations. But it is still on the books, it's still in existence until the constituency session. And at that time, the constituency session literally votes to dissolve churches that are no longer operating. Just before you start a constituency session, one of the first things you do is vote new churches that are operating but have not yet entered into the sisterhood of churches. And so one of the first acts is you vote them in to the sisterhood, and that way they're able to function. And so that's what we're talking about, is whether we can continue to fund Bass there at the executive committee. I shared with you that the executive committee is meeting January 7th. I think there are already at least 3 presentations from individuals who are bringing some plans from what I've shared. They're strong plans to share with our committee to kind of provide some ideas or of how we could move forward. On January 7th, that committee is going to have a couple of options, 2 options really to choose. They're going to be able to choose whether to continue funding Bass um, at that level. Um, and they'll be wrestling with how do we bring about a balanced budget with that. And you know, we're going to talk. I mean, what do we do with these shortfalls? We either pull reserves, we either lay off staff, or we find a way to put Bass on a sound financial basis, or we cease to operate Bass. And so they're going to wrestle with that. We're hoping, and I could just take a moment. The penny campaign was amazing, and I believe it will be significant to our committee to see the support, you know, from our conference. Is this really meaningful? You know, one of the challenges of Bass Academy is it's not central to our conference. It's in the lower southwest portion. And so we have many constituents throughout Alabama, some even further over in Florida, who just don't make it to the campus and aren't familiar with it. And so this kind of will be a gauge as to how much support there is out there for Bass. The second option is for us to look and begin to think about what would Adventist education look like if we pivoted, if we began to try to envision what it would look like in the future. I've already shared there is a trend towards keeping your children at home. There's a trend towards distance learning. I mean, nowadays you're able to get a college degree in your living room. There's new technologies that have opened up. Can we leverage those new technologies to continue to provide Seventh-day Adventist education for our young people in a more fiscally responsible manner, one that makes more sense on a financial basis? And so not much work has been done with this, but you'll see on the screen kind of an outline of what it might look like using the endowment. And for this next year, there may be a commitment, and this is something the executive committee needs to work on and decide if they decide to pivot and kind of look to the future, what Adventist education would look like. But providing a $10,000 scholarship to those who want to attend a boarding academy, And you know, it's interesting, if you're a part of our conference and you receive a 10,000, most of the academies are around the $20,000 mark. And you receive 10,000 from the conference and you're able to pay 800 a month. That's 8,000. That's 18,000 of your tuition. If that academy would give a couple of thousand of worthy student, what you actually have is that academy receiving a student into their body that actually is practically a full pay student. And so there's a benefit to that academy, there's a benefit to that student, there's a benefit to our conference, because now we're providing the same 29 students with a boarding academy experience, and we're doing it for $290,000 versus 2 million. I mean, that that's quite a gap. And we're still able to provide that experience. So that's part of what the committee will be talking about. Do we need to pivot? And then we talk about the inflationary and the challenges our elementary school are great and increasing. Um, if we don't do something to help with some of the funding at our elementary schools, I think we will be losing them in a few years. And so we talked about how could we help them, and this is just one of the ideas of that 434,000 funding that we talk about for Bass. We can take that, and this is just an idea. The committee has to work with it, but to each elementary school or student in that school, which could encompass a high school, it does for 3 of our schools, that we would give $1,000 per year subsidy. So if your school had 20,000, you would get $20,000 a year from the conference to just try to help defray those costs. Or if your school had 7 students in it, you would get $7,000 a year. We've got to do something to try to help lower those costs, and that would be a way to help. And then the third one, and it's pretty vague, is just beginning to look a little bit at distance learning and how that would work. It's interesting in Alabama, the state, if you choose to homeschool as this program rolls out, the state will actually give you $2,000 a year for homeschooling parents as they begin to try to pivot and look at distance learning and all of those types of things. So that's what the committee will be doing on January 7th. They'll be hearing presentations, and they'll be making a decision as to whether we move forward with Bass Academy, whether we pivot to seeing what Adventist education would look like in the environment in which we live in. And so, and then a decision will be made. I think I talked a little bit. The reason that decision needs to be made in January for the next school year is to give opportunity to the teachers to be able to share. We're just about at the end, and so I just want to share a little thing on the next steps we're receiving. There are those who are already putting plans together in place. There's some who've emailed me. You can feel free to do that. We're asking for pledges. If Bass Academy were to remain in operation another year, then we would ask that those pledges would come. Those pledges would go directly to Bass to help fund its operations. Carmen Atkins, sorry, Carmen, is kind of the lead person on that, or the coordinator for that. And so I wanted to give her an opportunity now just to share how you can reach her. You see the text on the screen. And so we're going to take a moment and try to bring Carmen on with us.
Hey, Brian, can you hear me?
Give it just a minute, Carmen. We're going to get you a little louder. Okay, I think you're good now.
Okay, you can hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so as of today, we've raised 76,500 per year for Bass. That's only with 23 people. And just wanted to encourage everybody to, if you wanted to make a pledge, to PM me through Facebook, or you're welcome to text me. My cell phone was put up on the screen there. I just want to also say again that this is a mission. I really feel like we are being re-energized for the mission work here that Bass has to offer. And I just want to encourage everybody to reach out, make a pledge. This is not just a money problem. I know that. We have a lot of things that need to be done. And I'm hearing a lot of people say to me, I'm not going to throw money at something if we're not going to affect change. So I want to take the opportunity also to challenge our leadership to say something on this call about the willingness to affect change if people are willing to invest. We can't ask people to invest in something if we're not willing to share a vision or affect change. And so, I keep getting asked that question. So I'm going to ask leadership to please comment on that.
Perfect, Holly, and I'll be glad to. I mean, I'm sorry. Yeah, Carmen. Yeah, I know. I'm just reading the screen. Sorry, Carmen and Holly, and George. Um, yeah, I do want to talk about, and it is important, doing what we've done and repeating it is not going to bring us to success. So, yes, this is the committee. Carmen mentioned the committee doesn't want to throw good money after bad too, and that's what they're wrestling with. The committee is wrestling with throwing $2 million down, and I don't think they're going to do that, hoping things will get better. If they choose to do that, there's going to be a plan in place to make things better, because we cannot keep throwing good money after bad either. If there's no good plan in place, then it's probably time to pivot and begin to see what we can do in other means. So um, if you're thinking about giving and you're not sure, um, we would be releasing those plans um, as that executive committee makes that decision. So yeah, we can't keep doing the same thing.